So I built several Gameboy Macros on this channel, 2 to be exact. They were both built using a DS Lite and an all-aluminum faceplate from Boxy Pixel, which is a bit on the pricey side. So this time around I thought I'd do something a little different. Let's instead make a Gameboy Macro using an original DS, and instead of some pricey faceplate or kit, let's make one on a budget by using the original shell only. And to top it off, let's attempt to make it look somewhat decent. So, can we make a good-looking Macro XL on a budget? Let's find out. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. So I have another Gameboy Macro mod that I wanted to do, but this time around it's going to be a little different. First, we're going to be doing this to a really damaged original DS, and second, we're going to be doing it on a budget. No fancy faceplate or pricey kit this time. All you'll need is a 330 ohm resistor and some of this sticky vinyl material, but we'll get into this a little bit later. The primary goals of this build is simplicity and price. We're not going to be making a Mona Lisa by any measure, but I do want an end product that hopefully looks decent, and all without using any Bondo or excessive amounts of sanding. So let's see what we're going to need for this project. Well, you'll need an original DS, one that hopefully needs a new lease on life, such as this one, but still has a working bottom portion. Next is a 330 ohm resistor, which, as you know by now, if you've been watching my videos, is what makes the DS think it still has the top half connected. Without this, the mod will not work. A small speaker, the smallest one you can find is best, such as the one from a Nintendo Switch. But this is optional actually because you can always scavenge one of the speakers from the top portion of your Nintendo DS. And lastly is some vinyl sheets with adhesive backing that hopefully matches the color of the DS you plan to mod. This here is silver, which seems to match up pretty closely to my DS. All the items you see here are linked in the description below if you do want to make one of these yourself. So without any further ado, let's get into this build. To get started, use a Phillips bit to remove the battery door and then remove the battery itself. Remove the 6 tri-point screws on the rear shell and then take a spudger to remove the rear shell. With the motherboard exposed, remove the Wi-Fi antenna cable, the bottom LCD ribbon cable, the 2 smaller ribbon cables below that, and lastly, the ribbon cable for the upper LCD screen. Next, remove the 3 Phillips screws on the motherboard and the single screw above the DS cartridge slot. With the motherboard free, go ahead and remove it. Now focusing on the front shell, let's remove the ribbon cable for the upper LCD. To do this, carefully peel the foam backing on the LCD. Once the foam is out of the way, we can carefully peel the ribbon cable off the LCD metal housing. With the ribbon cable out of the way, we can now access the screws which hold the hinge cover. Go ahead and remove it. So next we want to remove the top section of the DS. First, remove the 4 screw covers, as well as the screws below them. Take a spudger and separate the 2 halves of the top shell. Once separated, we can proceed to pushing the hinges out like so. The last thing to do is fish the LCD ribbon cable and the Wi-Fi cable out from the bottom half. Alright, looking good so far. If you don't have an extra speaker lying around, you can scavenge one from the top half of the DS we just removed. Great, let's move our attention to the motherboard. Let's now place our resistor between the pads labeled LED C2 and LED A2, and then solder it in place. Add more solder if needed. Now let's solder a speaker to the motherboard. Solder 1 wire to the pad labeled UI-GND, and then solder the other wire to the solder pad labeled SPL0. Now that all the modification to the PCB is done, let's work on the placement of the speaker. I want to put it somewhere below the action buttons, and I think my speaker is small and thin enough to fit. Once I test fitted and finalized the location of the speaker, I want to make just 3 small holes to allow the sound to come through. I'm going to make the holes using just my craft knife and perhaps a file to smooth things over. Just like that. Okay, next let's finish modding the shell by removing as much of the hinge as possible. The goal here is to make the shell as uniform as possible without disturbing the paint finish too much. All I'll be using here are my flush cutters, my craft knife, and a file. It's okay if it doesn't come out perfect, we're just trying to make it look better than if we left the hinges intact. The idea is to not resort to using any Bondo or other filler material. I want this to be as easy and cheap as possible so anyone can do it. So this is how everything looks so far. I think this is good enough for the final step of modding the shell. I bought some vinyl material with an adhesive backing, which sort of matches the color of the DS. The idea is to use the vinyl sheet to cover the holes in the shell. Well, it's certainly not perfect, but it looks better than having the hinges sticking out. Now, let's put everything back together. And there it is, a Gameboy Macro XL. So first and foremost, this is obviously not as refined looking as the DS Lite with a boxy pixel faceplate. But the only cost of materials here was the 330 ohm resistor, which is only a few cents. The vinyl material I bought was actually for another project, so I'm actually not going to include that in the total cost. And also it was completely optional anyway. Another option you could use instead is something that I'm sure many of you have lying around the house, electrical tape. This can also be used to cover the holes and is readily available in many colors, and it's also rather inexpensive. Another potential cost would be the speaker, but like I mentioned before, you can always scavenge one from the DS itself. So as far as costs are concerned, you could theoretically make a DS Macro for under $1 provided you already have the console. Now I want to discuss a couple things that I sort of discovered while making this macro. First, the original DS plastic is extremely brittle. My shell actually cracked and I had to glue it back together. So be careful and gentle during the disassembly and reassembly process. It may even be better to get a new aftermarket shell as a backup or replacement. The other thing I noticed is there seems to be just enough room for a front-facing speaker. A lot of the Macro XL mods seem to put the speaker in the rear, which I personally think is not ideal. The Nintendo Switch speaker seems to fit perfectly, and I've seen some people online place a DS speaker in that exact location. So let's get into the pros and cons of doing a macro mod on an original DS. One of the best things about this mod is that Game Boy Advance cards don't stick out of the bottom like they do on a DS Lite, and one could argue that the larger form factor is a bit more comfortable to hold. Now, the biggest con in my opinion is the LCD screen itself. It is extremely dim, especially when compared to a DS Lite. It appears to be front lit, much like the AGS-001. It also doesn't have any brightness controls, just an on and off switch, again like the AGS-001. So overall, I'm happy with the results, especially for it being a budget build. So what did you think of this mod? Do you like the DS Lite version of the macro or this one? Do you think the vinyl sheets did a good job of hiding the holes, or would you have done it a different way? I'd really be interested to hear what y'all think. Leave a comment below and let me know. I hope you did enjoy the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Macho Nacho Productions. I release content every Thursday, so be sure to turn on notifications. And as always, we'll see you next time.